Now, one of the things I think is clear about you, anyone who knows you, is your devotion to your family. And the time when you were a young professional, it played out a little differently then than it does today. There was a stricter division of labor. Men didn't always get involved with child care. My impression is you forged a different path for yourself.
My wife and I were blessed with 3 daughters. Turned out all 3 became lawyers. I would have bet you anything in the world none of them would have become a lawyer. It was a shock to me that they became lawyers. But we used to have, the kids tell me that we used to have great conversations at dinner, and they got interested. Anyway, all 3 became lawyers. None of them really practiced law, but they used the legal training in their work. Last week, one daughter, the oldest daughter, Nell, testified in Congress on a very important issue of executive compensation. Another daughter, Martha, became dean of the Harvard Law School. And a third daughter was lecturing on library law at Stanford. So the 3 of them surprised their mother and me greatly.
I know whenever I have a compliment to pay about one of your daughters, the answer that your wife, Jo, always gives is, oh, which one are you?
Which one are you talking about?
Because there are 3 and there's so much going on.
I understand Mrs. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower's mother, was once told, you must be very proud of your son. And she said, which one? And I think that's the way to be.
But what I was getting at before is I have the sense that despite the challenges of being a partner in major law firms and despite the challenges of public service, you spend a lot of time with your children.
Yes, and I think that being a parent, I think it's very important, particularly with the children, of having your meals together. I think today's world, where I see how people live, they don't always do that.
There aren't always meals.
No. It's a different way of doing things.
Now, let's take ourselves to 1960. During the election campaign, could you have imagined that you would land a position such as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission?
No, I was crazy about Jack Kennedy. We got to know the Kennedys. Well, I'd met some of them during the Stevenson campaigns, but we really got to know the Kennedys through the Shrivers. Eunice Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's sister, lived in Chicago with her husband, Sarge Shriver, who was running the merchandise mart for his wife's family. And we really got to know them very well. They introduced us to Jack. And I was very keen on Adlai Stevenson picking Jack Kennedy as his running mate in '56. I felt he was the perfect choice for running mate. Adlai left it convention open to decide, and remember, it turned out to be a fight between Kefauver and Kennedy lost it at the last minute.
And that was unprecedented, the idea of throwing it open to
right.
the convention.
And it turned out it was a blessing for Jack Kennedy. In 1960, after Stevenson lost, Stevenson was invited to give the Gridiron dinner speech in Washington, and he asked me to come with him. And I went, and the night before there was a small dinner party, and Jack and Jackie Kennedy were there. I hadn't seen Jack Kennedy since the election. And he came up to me and he said, thanks for helping me to get the vice presidential nomination. I said, it was a lucky thing you didn't get it. He said, you're right. I said, you know, at that time we called him Jack. I said, Jack, I said, if you're still interested, you can probably get the vice presidential nomination next time. And he looked at me and he said, vice president? Vice president? He said, I'm going to run for president next time. And I said, are you crazy? I said, you're only 39 years old. And he said, if I'm ever going to get it, it's going to be next time. And he ended up getting it. And I told that story to Barack Obama in 2006 when he was thinking of running for president. I wrote a piece in the Tribune about it. I said, you ought to listen to Kennedy. You can't pick your time for these things. Yeah, if there's an opening, you got to go for it. But Jack Kennedy, the day after he was elected, Sarge called me. And he said, the president-elect has asked me to be his recruiter, and he'd like you to come into the government. Is there any job you would like? And I said, no. I said, I've got a wife and 3 children. I think my partners may go in the government. I can't even think I can't afford it. And he said, well, if you change your mind, let me know. But he said, even if you can't do that, could you help me with the recruiting? And I said, yes. Well, during the course of the next couple months, somebody knew I was very, very interested in the FCC. And they called one day and said, would you like to be chairman of the FCC? And that's what happened.
Now, going back to the nomination in 1960, I remember there, I think it was in the Cow Palace, the convention, Eleanor Roosevelt was still trying to stir up support for Adlai Stevenson. Were you ever torn in 1960 about Stevenson?
I wanted Stevenson to endorse Kennedy. Bill Blair and I picked up Jack Kennedy on May 29th, 1960, his birthday, at O'Hare Airport. It was the day after the last primary in Oregon. We drove him out to Libertyville, to Adlai's farm, and we maneuvered the 2 of them to go off privately into Adlai's study, and it came out. I could see it hadn't gone well. And on the way out in the car, I never forgot, it was the most interesting experience I ever had in politics. Bill Blair was driving the car, Jack Kennedy was sitting in the front seat, I was sitting in the back seat. And Jack said, any advice what I should say to Adlai? And we're talking. Jack said, should I offer him Secretary of State if I'm elected? And Bill Blair's wiser than I am, he didn't say anything. So I said, if I were you, I wouldn't do that. He said, why? I said, first, he'll be offended. And second, you should have your hands free to make your own choice when you are elected. So we go out there and they finished their conference, we get back in the car. And I'm dying to know what happened. So I said, did you offer him vice president? I mean, Secretary of State? He said, you told me not to. So I said to him, I said, what have I done? So I called Adlai and I told him the whole story. He said, you did the right thing. He said, I would have been very offended and he should have his hands free to. So then I thought I better tell Jack. So I called Jack. He was going to Hyannis for a family birthday party. He wasn't there yet. I got Bob on the phone. So I told him the whole story from the beginning to the end, exactly as it happened. And he said, well, thanks for telling me. He said, you were probably right, but thanks for telling me. So I felt I had a clear conscience. Now, it turned out that Adlai desperately wanted to be Secretary of State, but Kennedy didn't offer it to him.
Yeah, I remember after the election, there was a lot of speculation in the press. Would he or would he not give it to him? And then he gave them the ambassadorship to the United Nations. Now, did Stevenson regard that as a consolation prize?
I drove him home one night when that was being considered. The best conversations I ever had when we were in the car, because it was like an hour and a quarter to go to Libertyville. We're driving in the car. He said, I'm not going to take that. I said, why? He said, I had that job. I said, you didn't have that job. I said, you helped organize the first UN. You were never ambassador to the UN. I said, what are you going to do if you say no? He said, well, I'll continue to write and speak. I said, you'll be on page 47 in small type in the New York Times. And he said, I'm not going to do it. I knew down deep he would, because I knew him. And he did, and I think he was glad he did.
How do you think each of the two of them did during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Both did very well. I had one small role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was called a week before the thing happened by George Ball, the Undersecretary of State. He said, where are you going to be the next week? He didn't tell me why or what, but it was the only time that's ever happened to me. So I knew something was going on. And I said, I'm going to be in New York next week speaking to the European broadcasters about the satellites. He said, leave a number where I can get you all the time. So I was having breakfast at 7 in the morning in New York with Frank Stanton, the head of CBS. We were both going to speak to the European broadcast. And the waiter came up to me. And he said, the White House is calling you. It's urgent. I got up, and it was Pierre Salinger. He said, get down here immediately and come straight to the White House. So I rushed back to Washington. And Pierre said, the Russians have missiles in Cuba. The president wants to speak to the world tonight, and he wants especially to get it into Cuba. But all the Voice of America is being blocked. Now, he said, we're told that there are 4 American radio stations that send signals into Cuba. We want you to get those 4 stations to cover this. But you can't tell them what it is. So I was, a kid. I said, okay, I'll take care of it. So I went to the office. I called in the key staff people and told them. They said, you can't do that. We didn't even do that during World War II. I said, don't tell me we can't do it. We're going to do it. Just tell me how to do it. And they said, well, we can order from AT&T a line connecting the Voice of America transmitter to each of these stations. Turns out there were 8, not 4. I said, do it. So they did. I said, will the stations know it? They said, no. So we got that in place. Then I thought it over for a while. And I said, we have to tell the stations. This is ridiculous. So I called Pierre and I said, I'm going to have to call the stations. He said, we can't stand a leak. I said, let me do it my way. So I called each of the stations myself, and I said, I want the owner of the station give me your number, at 6 p.m., you're going to get an emergency important call, and it's going to come from the White House.